This is lecture number DR035LW01. This is the 35th of the Mega Genius Lectures and the first of the Lost Wisdom series. It was recorded on 4 November 2010. The title of this lecture is Applying the Genius Formula. It is 33 minutes long. Copyright 2010 by Mega Genius. All rights reserved. This lecture is protected by internationally valid copyright. It may not, in whole or in part, be duplicated, transmitted, or otherwise reproduced without the express permission of Mega Genius. Unauthorized translation, importation, or distribution is a violation of applicable laws. Mega Genius is a United States federally registered trademark and service mark. And now, here is Mega Genius.
This is Level 4 of the Mega Genius Lectures, titled The Lost Wisdom Series. It consists of the most intelligent answers to fundamental questions that have confounded the human race for millions of years. Although you should have already listened to the first 3 levels of the Mega Genius Lectures, unless you are willing to challenge and restructure your reality even more, you should proceed no further. Quote, "There is a fine line between genius and insanity," unquote, stated Oscar Levant, the late American motion picture actor, pianist, and composer. And even though that was one of the most screwball assertions anyone ever uttered, millions of people desperately wanted to believe it, and therefore accepted it as true. Why did they do that? Because they could all use that assertion to justify their own intellectual deficiencies. You see, they reasoned that it would be wise to avoid increasing their intellectuality too much so as to never approach that fine line that someone, who didn't know what he was talking about, had claimed existed between genius and insanity. Do you see how nonsensical Mr. Levant's assertion was, despite the fact that millions of people subsequently subscribed to it? They believed him. Actually, the essence of genius lives in the life universe, and the core of insanity exists in the physical universe. Consequently, the line between true genius and insanity is as wide as the distance between 2 different universes, so to speak. Mr. Levant could not have been more mistaken. I stressed in the Genius Formula series of the Mega Genius Lectures that there is an immense difference between merely having a genius and being one. The witty and talented Mr. Levant had several geniuses, but a genius he was not. The proof is that he recognized that the line was fine between himself and insanity. And it was. If you were to research his life, you would discover a tortured existence punctuated with many major deviations from intellectuality, including hypochondria, classic stage fright, prescription drug addiction, and even frequent commitments to mental institutions. Now, the reason that I brought this up is that I want to remind you where we are going. We want to keep our objective in mind, which is increased intelligence and its resultant effects, which include improved well-being, happiness, and abilities. In this, the Lost Wisdom series of lectures, I'm going to explain how you can greatly increase your understanding of and ability to apply the Genius Formula, the revolutionary and highly acclaimed technique that enables others of at least average intellect to skyrocket their intelligence. I'm going to begin by confessing something about the Genius Formula. Agatha Christie, the English best-selling crime writer, said that she got her best ideas while sitting in a bathtub eating apples. Well, the Genius Formula is not something that I invented one day while I was eating a durian. I should explain that. The fruit called durian grows where I used to live. It is native to Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia, where it is known as the king of fruits. It has a superb taste, like custard, caramel, and roasted almonds, but with the odor of turpentine, rotten onions, sewage, and an old gymnasium sock. Actually, that's not accurate. Durian smells worse than that. So much so that it is illegal to carry durian on public transportation in Southeast Asia. Obviously, I have eaten durian and the memory is still vivid. Now, pardon me for digressing, but my point is that I did not invent the genius formula while doing anything. I did not invent the formula at all. Oh, I thought up the words, the genius formula, as a phrase, and I trademarked that, but I cannot take credit for inventing the formula. It is a principle which can be expressed in mathematical symbols that reflects truth upon which life and the physical universe are based. I merely isolated that truth and thereby discovered it, and then formulated it so that I could easily communicate it to others. Do you see? I did not invent the truth of the genius formula. I merely discovered it. In the year 2000, I announced my discovery of the genius formula and simultaneously recorded the Mega Genius Lectures as a contribution to humanity's evolution into the 21st century. The Mega Genius Lectures have consisted of 3 levels, 6 lectures in Level 1, the Genius Formula series, 20 lectures in Level 2, the Uncommon Sense series, and 8 lectures in Level 3, the Whole Truth series. In those 34 lectures of slightly less than 24 hours duration, I explained every major aspect of humanity's existence from beyond the top of the IQ scale. Throughout recorded history, that was an objective that no one had ever attempted. The Mega Genius Lectures have been extremely well received, although the recordings have been heard primarily by faculty members and students of universities and by physicians, attorneys, and other professional business people and their families. It is not an exaggeration to say that they have enabled people from all sectors of life to appreciably improve their lives by their own estimation. And that is the proof. The continuous unsolicited flow of testimonials from appreciative listeners. Often solitary sentences in those lectures here and there have changed people's lives forever, not because I spoke them particularly artfully, but because my words directed people's attention to truth. Listeners heard what I said, and then looked where I had directed their attention, and then recognized truth, and subsequently made fantastic changes to their lives. However, don't miss the point that they did it themselves by looking. For instance, I recall meeting a fellow who told me that he used to consume too much alcohol, was overweight, and was too often unhappy. Then he had heard me say in the lectures, quote, "Unhappiness is not an intelligent state of existence," unquote. The man had been stunned. He told me that he had always believed that he had an inalienable right to be unhappy, but then suddenly it had dawned on him that he did not. At least he could not insist upon that if he wanted to perceive the subject of happiness intelligently, so he stopped drinking, lost considerable weight, and significantly improved his attitude, and therefore his life. 2 years later, I met him again when he hired me for a personal consultation. Not only had he remained off the alcohol and maintained his reduced weight, he had assumed the appearance of a leading man in a motion picture. In addition to having achieved astounding mental improvements, he had gained remarkable physical changes too, merely from hearing a single sentence, and then looking where I had directed his attention, then recognizing more truth, and then acting upon it. He was one of the first students of the lectures to significantly change his life, but since then thousands of others have attained similar results. They send testimonials to me daily. This is not to say that everyone has been pleased with the Mega Genius Lectures. For example, a couple of years after I released them, a small group of anonymous critics, anonymous mind you, publicly declared that the lectures were totally unworkable. As it turned out, however, none of the critics had ever heard a single lecture. They had merely concluded that the lectures could not possibly work, much like the two Frenchmen in 1934, an entomologist and an engineer, who concluded that the bumblebee was aerodynamically unable to fly. Another fellow, a Scandinavian gentleman, listened to the Mega Genius lectures, but wrote that he was displeased. However, shortly thereafter he wrote again, explaining that although his mind originally had been too filled with misunderstanding to discover the value of the lectures, he had subsequently found enough truth in them to honestly say that he was now happy with them. It was considerate of him to share that with me, and it is understandable. The full value of the Mega Genius lectures is not immediately apparent, as so many of you have discovered by listening to them repeatedly. I also recall a psychiatrist who had ordered and listened to the Mega Genius lectures and appreciated them, but politely suggested that I may have spoken too harshly about psychiatrists. Apparently he also had a misunderstanding, since although I have pointed out that the profession of psychiatry has less workability than placebos, according to its own statistics, I have never voiced any criticism of psychiatrists as individuals. I'm sure that most psychiatrists would like to be helpful, and I have known several who were congenial. In fact, the last psychiatrist with whom I had an intelligible conversation I can honestly refer to as a friend, and that is entirely aside from the fact that he had become so disappointed with psychiatry himself that he agreed enthusiastically with everything that I said. I also heard from a famous psychologist and motivational speaker who had listened to the Mega Genius lectures and gained considerably from them. He said that his life had been a mess, and that the public had not been aware that he had been all image and no substance. Nevertheless, judging from his praise of the lectures, he is now in a considerably better position to help others. Therefore, I can tell you that as of this date, 10 years after I recorded the first 3 levels of the Mega Genius lectures, to the best of my knowledge, every person who has actually heard them views them favorably. In addition, the lectures have been highly acclaimed on ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN television, MSNBC, Talk Radio Network, Fox News, Clear Channel, Sirius Satellite Radio, Reuters News Service, EIN News in more than 300 countries and regions, and many other radio stations, magazines, and prominent newspapers around the globe. I have a list here of countries throughout which the Mega Genius lectures have been disseminated. Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Bulgaria, Canada, the Czech Republic, the People's Republic of China, Denmark, England, Finland, Germany, the Hellenic Republic, Hungary, India, Indonesia, the Republic of Ireland, Italy, the Kingdom of Bahrain, Macedonia, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Norway, the Philippines, the Republic of Croatia, the Republic of Cyprus, the Republic of Singapore, the Republic of South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, Taiwan, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates, and the United States of America, and dozens of other countries. The Mega Genius lectures are recognized on 6 continents as the most advanced technique of the 21st century for increasing human intelligence. I thank all of you for having listened to the Mega Genius lectures, levels 1, 2, and 3. I am very proud of you for having done that. Many of you have told me in many words and languages that the lectures have enabled you to change significantly for the better, by giving you an entirely new perspective on life and your purpose in it. Thank you for expressing such sincere appreciation. As for myself, I am as mentally and physically healthy as ever. Life goes as right as one is able and willing to make it go right. And my life is a bowl of cherries jubilee. And I'm looking forward to sharing more of the recipe for that dessert with you now. Innumerable times I've been asked, when are you going to record more Mega Genius lectures? My answer has continually been, apparently not soon enough. Although no one has questioned the workability of the Genius formula, a few of you have had technical questions about using it. If you have had any difficulty applying the formula, I'm going to begin addressing that matter now. The human mind, which is not the brain, actually works perfectly, accurately processing more data than there are neurons in the brain, unless the mind is being subjected to interference. Since many people process information slowly and often arrive at illogical conclusions, obviously many people are encountering interference. Rocks and weeds and destructive insects must be identified and dealt with before a beautiful lawn can flourish. Similarly, falseness must be identified and processed before one can arrive at truth. So must various interferences be identified and addressed before one can achieve an increased ability to differentiate quickly and accurately. It is imperative that you eliminate unnecessary considerations, decisions, and activities and other factors that can interfere with your objective of applying the Genius formula effectively. Otherwise, you will apply the formula ineffectively and will think yourself into false conclusions. I have mentioned some of these factors in earlier lectures. Now I want to address all of them. The primary factors that can interfere with your ability to use the Genius formula are what I call idiocies, because disregarding any one of them is an act of sheer idiocy. They are the factors that challenge and can ruin your intellectual abilities. There are 10 of them. You need to ensure that you have eliminated them. I'm going to begin addressing the idiocies in the next lecture, and then later give you tips that you can use to more easily apply the Genius formula. First, however, consider this. An interesting thing about the Genius formula is that the more important that an issue is, the easier it is to explain how the Genius formula can be applied to intelligently accomplish one's desired objective, and the more frivolous that something is, the trickier it is to communicate how to use the formula. For example, it is easier to understand how to use the formula to discover a lost treasure than how to use it to intelligently scratch an itch. Now, let's start with a noteworthy objective which will be easy to understand. I will give you an example of how I innately used the Genius formula to crack the world's most famous crime of the 19th century. It is difficult for me to find mysteries that interest me in this universe. Fortunately, there are other universes. Several years ago, though, I realized that I ought to solve the mystery of Jack the Ripper, the anonymous serial killer of London's East End, who had horrifically slaughtered a succession of women near the Whitechapel district in 1888, resulting in global media frenzy. For nearly 120 years, the identity of the murderer had baffled researchers, crime historians, and all authorities on the criminal mind, from Greater London's famed Scotland Yard to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's celebrated Sherlock Holmes to Agatha Christie, the Queen of Crime. No one could fit all the puzzle pieces together to solve the famous mystery. Ripperologists, as investigators of the case are called, had arguably reached a dead end. Their conclusions were usually the places where they had gotten exhausted thinking. In 2002, Philip Sugden, the highly respected author of the book The Complete History of Jack the Ripper, confidently wrote, quote, "It is exceedingly unlikely that the murderer will be unmasked now." In 2005, when Jack the Ripper was still the world's most famous murder mystery, without a glimmer of a resolution in sight, I decided to tackle it in my spare time, just as a hobby. Although the conundrum had withstood the highest degree of investigation, I knew it would be no match for the Genius Formula. As I explained in Level 1 of the Mega Genius Lectures, the world's most mystifying magic tricks are based upon erroneous assumptions. Therefore, since this series of crimes had mystified so many esteemed investigators for so long, I anticipated from the beginning that all of them were making at least one erroneous assumption of magnitude. Expanding my attention, I opened the door to what appeared to be a dungeon of difficulties. For example, I learned that there existed at least 165 books about the case, and thousands of newspaper and magazine articles worldwide. I faced sorting through all of them. The names of many streets in the Whitechapel district had been changed through the decades. All the police, witnesses, suspects, and reporters who had lived in 1888 had died. The locations of all the murderers were on the other side of the planet. Thousands of 19th and 20th century investigators who had sought to identify Jack the Ripper had thrown up their hands in despair. Solving this legendary case seemed daunting, but I knew that the Genius Formula would work as effectively as I applied it. It took weeks to obtain all the pertinent research materials from various sources so that I could examine it, and then more time to filter, disregard, analyze, distill, and compare all the facts. I memorized street names, addresses, and thousands of data about the killings, and then journeyed to London's East Side to track down and personally examine each crime scene and even measure the distances between all the locations of interest. Actually, expanding my attention and examining all the research material was hardly necessary, since it was so obvious that some crucial assumption had been made, and then agreed with by virtually everyone familiar with the case. Yet I had to study all the details of the murders, if for no reason other than to be able to discuss the case in depth after I had solved it. After all, how would it have looked if I had solved a world-famous crime that I knew virtually nothing about? By the time that I had finished my examination, I had learned everything that 12 decades of research by thousands of investigators could reveal. I knew just about everything that could be known about the case, except who the serial killer was, which was the one thing that no other investigator knew either. Yet I knew something else about the mystery that was more important. I knew that I had not made a single assumption about the identity of Jack the Ripper. Therefore, I knew beyond any doubt that at least one central character in the case had made a crucial assumption, and so had everyone who had scrutinized the case subsequently. Accordingly, that central character must have had the credentials to sway the thought processes of every person who had ever studied the case. Even Her Majesty Queen Victoria, who had studied the Ripper's murders as they occurred, did not have that much influence over the case. Rather, the central character who had made some crucial and authoritatively persuasive assumption was most likely highly placed within Scotland Yard. In September of 2005, I released 4 Mega Genius intelligence briefings summarizing the case and foretelling that I would soon solve the legendary mystery. Then on Halloween, 31 October 2009, after I had given everyone time to study and ponder the case, I revealed the step-by-step logic of the solution in 2 more Mega Genius intelligence briefings, and I identified Jack the Ripper by name. The Genius Formula had worked perfectly. The key to solving the world's most famous murder mystery had been to realize that on 12 November 1988, one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials of Scotland Yard, an inspector in charge of the detectives who were working on the case, had assumed that an allegation that had been made by a man whom he had never met before that day was true. In fact, the man's allegation was a blatant lie. Consequently, for the following 120 years, his assumption had stumped the field of law enforcement worldwide. The unadorned truth was that Scotland Yard had fooled itself. Now, let's look at that formula's application regarding some matter of minor significance. I recall being asked once if there is a way prior to making a decision to determine if you have expanded your attention enough, examined thoroughly enough, and excluded assumptions sufficiently to arrive at a correct decision to achieve your objective. In other words, can you be sure that you have applied the Genius formula adequately? Well, let's address that question, since spending an eternity trying to figure out your breakfast would not be an intelligent act. If you think about your breakfast intelligently, you will have an acceptable breakfast to consume when you want to consume it, with the ability to consume it, where you want to consume it, in a satisfactory manner. In this imaginary breakfast, you may need to ensure that you have enough cereal, milk, and maybe fruit, and a bowl and spoon, and a space in which to consume it, and a healthy body with which to consume it, and the time in which to consume it. Therefore, you need to have expanded your attention to ensure that you have cereal, milk, a bowl, some fruit, a spoon, a table and chair at which to sit, a reasonably functioning body, and a few minutes of time in which to consume your breakfast. Now, that may all seem elementary, but things can go wrong with a breakfast. For example, you also need to have examined the objects at some point to ensure that you are not using a 3-year-old box of screaming yellow zonkers if you meant to be eating Fruit Loops, that your milk is not sour, that your fruit is not spoiled, that your bowl and spoon are not only available but washed, and of course that the table and chair are there, that your body is functioning reasonably well, and that you are keeping an eye on your clock. You also may need to ensure that you have not assumed that every cereal box with multicolored pictures of fruit is Fruit Loops, that 14-day-old milk is still good, that red raspberries will hold for 5 days, that the dishwasher that you loaded last night ran and worked properly, and that after dallying in the bathroom for 5 extra minutes studying your face from different angles, you still have time to eat your cereal, etc. If you do those things without really thinking about most of them, your breakfast will almost invariably go right. However, if you violate the formula by not examining the cereal box when you buy it, and by not examining the expiration date on the milk when you bought it, and by assuming that you have enough time without keeping an eye on the clock, and by assuming that you have enough fruit to eat for the week without checking on it, and so on, you invite problems because you are disregarding the formula. Normally, you do not have to think about how global politics influence farm tax deductions and economics of the dairy industry to ensure that you have a breakfast. So, how can you be sure that you have applied the Genius formula adequately? The answer is that you estimate how thoroughly you need to apply the formula based upon the importance of the matter. You will want to apply the formula more thoroughly if your car just stopped running on a freeway than if you just discovered a hangnail. Therefore, you will want to continually estimate the importance of carefully applying the Genius formula throughout each day. Another point that I want to address is that sometimes after a person begins using the Genius formula, he will become concerned because he doesn't immediately feel that he is thinking more intelligently. Well, just as nothing is static and absolutely unchanging in the physical universe, except a life entity itself, which is technically not part of the physical universe, his intelligence will not remain unchanged. If examined closely enough, his intelligence will be found to be decreasing or increasing, at least slightly. If a person is applying the formula but not acting more intelligently, then it is in some manner a matter of ethics. For example, a person could not apply the formula every weekday and chug-a-lug a fifth of rum every weekend and expect to act more intelligently overall. But the fellow with whom we are dealing, you see, doesn't immediately begin feeling more intelligent when he consciously uses the formula. Well, I am not particularly concerned with how he feels. He will feel smarter later. I'm only concerned early on with how he acts. If you have wondered about the increase in your intelligence, imagine this conversation between you and me. I say, "How are you doing these days, my friend?" You say, "Oh, well, I love your lectures, but I'm not sure that I feel more intelligent." I say, "Well, how have you been using the genius formula?" You say, "I observe things farther away from me, and I look at things more closely, and I try not to assume so many things." I say, "Well, that's good. Now, can you give me some examples of how applying those steps has helped you?" You say, "Well, I noticed that clouds were moving quickly yesterday, and then that the wind had started to pick up, so I decided to work inside, and sure enough, it suddenly started pouring rain. And I was examining my driver's license and noticed that it was about to expire, so I renewed it in time. And instead of assuming that my car seat was vacant yesterday, I looked down this time before I jumped inside, and I kept myself from landing on my sunglasses and breaking them again." I say, "By the way, are you acting more intelligently these days?" You say, "Well, I guess I am. I guess I am acting more intelligently now that I think about it." I say, "Well, great, because I am not nearly as concerned with how you feel as how you act. If you act more intelligently today, you will notice that your life is going far better tomorrow." All right, now, I have brought you up to date, and we've reviewed the genius formula. To think highly intelligently, it is imperative that you eliminate the 10 idiocies. I'll begin addressing them in the next lecture.